Let's get everyone a minute to get situated with their drinks and their snacks. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll. We're just curious to see what's bringing you to today's webinar. Is it educational? Are you in the beginning stages of your TPRM journey? Do you love hearing British accents? Either way, no judgment from me here. I love them too. With that said, let's go ahead and get some introductions rolling. My name is Ashley. I work in business development over here at Prevalent, and we are joined with some very special aforementioned guests. First up, our project manager, Thomas Humphreys. How's it going, Thomas?
Yep, good. All good here.
Our solutions engineer, Sophie Pothecary. How's it going, Sophie?
All good, thank you, Ashley. Hope you are too.
Thanks. And last but certainly not least in my book, our very own VP of Product Marketing, Scott Lang. How's it going, Scott?
Great, Ashley. Hope everybody's doing well today.
Just a quick reminder, this webinar is being recorded and we will be sending out a copy along with the presentation slides shortly after the webinar. I have you all muted, but I love questions. Sophie loves questions. Thomas loves questions. So please drop them in the Q&A box and they'll go over them at the end of the webinar. Today, Thomas and Sophie will be discussing how to use the ISO framework to measure your TPRM program success. So I'll go ahead and pitch things over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ashley. And yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Thomas Humphreys and welcome to this webinar where we're focusing on ISO 27001 and its links with TPRM with a special focus on how can we draw out the controls and requirements when looking at KPIs, KRIs, and other measurements to ensure a successful outcome. I'm joined by Sophie. Sophie, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you very much, Thomas. Happy to be here today. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. So I'm one of the solutions engineers here at Prevalent, working closely with Thomas and the wider team to further develop TPRM programs and success across ISO 27001 and others. Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you very much. And myself, Thomas Humphreys, I've been with Prevalent for 5 years. I was previously an ISO auditor for the best part of 10 years, working across many standards, not least around 27001 on a local and global level, both in certification bodies in the UK and in Singapore. Just a very brief bit of housekeeping. As Ashley's mentioned, as usual, with these webinars, we like to save some time at the end for a Q&A, but obviously throughout today, where appropriate, we'll answer some questions as well. So any questions that come to mind, please post them into there should be a Q&A chat box or window. And then as we go through, we'll try and answer as many as we can. So let's kick off looking at what we're going to be covering today. I'll give an overview of 27001, paying particular attention to some of the newer elements since the standard was re-released, before looking at how we can map standard TPRM practices across to 27000 and an information security management system. I'll take a look at some of the key controls and how we can derive and identify key controls, particularly if we're just starting out on that journey of using 27 for the first time. I'll then touch on performance and risk indicators and what that can look like for your TPRM journey, as well as around the 27000 standard itself, before finishing with some next steps and where we can go from here, and how you can take some of this information forward when you're either beginning your journey or if you're already partly through or ongoing on a TPRM process. So start with an introduction to ISO 27. So for anyone who's unfamiliar, 27 is ISO's principal standard on information security. It's one of their older standards and also its most widely adopted standards. The overall structure and approach of 27001 is to provide a framework, a structured framework for an organization, to identify and set some governance in place in terms of identifying risk in terms of information security risk, and then managing that risk through a series of activities, controls, policies, and processes as well. So it's built around a very strong core of governance in terms of how you manage the life cycle of information security management, as well as risk and good risk practices and risk best practices as well. As I say, it's internationally recognized. It's one of the most widely adopted frameworks, and not too dissimilar to many of the other ISO standards. One of the reasons it's so widely adopted is its universal approach. So regardless of size and complexity of organizations, regardless of industries, sectors, and even geographies, there's always a use case to be had for how you can build best practice around 27,000, whether it's from a certification standpoint or purely using the standard to drive that best practice and understanding of a good security posture. Just briefly to note that there are many other standards. We'll be briefly touching on 27002 because there's a close relationship between 27001, which is the certifiable standard, and 27002, which provides those implementation guidelines on how we can apply and develop and build upon those security controls and what those controls look like in practice. It's always important to note that although we're focusing on 27001 and 2 specifically, as is common with ISO, they build what they call a family of wider standards, which can sometimes be used to address sector or technology specific applications on how 27001 could be best used. So, for example, how it can be used for a cloud environment and cloud provider, or how 27001 could be applied, say, in the healthcare sector or in the legal sector, for example. And so there's quite a wider variety of frameworks out there, but nevertheless, we'll be dealing very much with 27001 and 2. So a very brief background. So in 2022, the standard was re-released. Roughly every 5 years, ISO make the decision to formally review all their standards, and the decision was made that 27001 was needed to be updated. And they seek to make updates based on new and emerging technologies, where there are changes in the way standards are used, the way standards are managed as well. And two of the biggest outputs of this was a restructuring of the clauses. So for those who are perhaps less familiar, 27001 is split across two main sections. One is the governance, leadership, management section of what they call ISMS. And then the second part is what they used to call Annex A, which is where all the technical controls, organizational controls are identified, and the selection of which controls to meet the organization's use case and business cases. So there's a restructuring of these clauses, and they split them across what they're called 4 control areas: organizational, people, physical, and technological based controls. So from an organizational perspective, areas in terms of access, business continuity, and incident management and response; people in terms of background checks, personnel training, and onboarding; obviously physical controls in terms of physical protection of information systems; and then technological controls, particularly around from a data security perspective, so backup and encryption, addressing malware, addressing vulnerability and threat management. Secondly, and perhaps more interestingly, it developed these 3 areas it calls operational capability, control types, and cybersecurity concepts. And these are areas that I think are quite relevant, particularly with regards to some of the areas we're covering today around identifying key controls and identifying or how we can use the standard from a KPI, KRI perspective. But broadly speaking, these have been identified and are useful in helping an organization plan for and implement the controls to address the security risks that they've identified through the risk management process. And these are attributes that have been developed throughout the framework and are developed in more depth around 27002. But as we'll see as we go along later today, they can provide some useful indicators of trending and trend analysis and where critical controls can be identified and derived as well.
And Thomas, that's really interesting in terms of that restructure. Would you say that that kind of split across the four control areas as opposed to the two, does that make it more applicable to some of these organizations? You said, it's widely adopted. Does that make it easier for an organization to kind of adhere to these standards with that split now being across four control
Sure.
areas?
It can do in many ways, yes. I mean, as I said, yes. Regardless of whether you're a large, say, software house, or you're a small advertising agency, or you're in the manufacturing industry, or a completely different industry, the fact that there's now a restructuring, it's important to note that roughly 90 to 95% of the controls have still remained from the older 27,000 framework. But yes, the fact that they've now been reorganized, and particularly with use of things like these operational capabilities, it can make it easier for companies to say, well, what's important to us, and when we're thinking about the risks we've identified, how can we look at the most appropriate set of controls, whether it's from an organizational governance perspective or technical perspective, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Just want to touch on this section. This is now that has increased slightly, particularly from a 27,002 perspective. So there's always been a case in previous iterations of 27,001 and its even the original British standards as well, around managing third-party or managing suppliers in the supply chain, and it's quite worth noting that even now it provides those same requirements for managing information security across the supply chain, whether it's dealing with how we identify information security risks across our third-party base, how we address those security risks through the application of controls, particularly in terms of supplier agreements and supplier contracts, and what we want to capture in terms of what our third parties are delivering to us. Thinking about the wider supply chain, so where there are, say, fourth, fifth, or even further on down the supply chain, and there are a series of organizations, the consideration that goes into how, through our third-party agreements, for example, we can enforce or at least inquire about pertinent security controls that are important to us. And then, of course, monitoring, reviewing, and change management when there's change to supplier activities and services, or monitoring the performance through performance reviews, audits, on-site and remote audits, and so forth as well. What's quite interesting here is, and one of the changes when you're looking at particularly numbers 1 and 2, is the expansion of the description through 27,002, not too dissimilar for other standards such as NIST 800-161, for anyone who knows about that framework. So the cybersecurity supply chain risk management framework that touches on the wider A to Z of how you manage your supply chain and your third-party base. So from identification of third parties all the way through to exit agreements and establishing supplier agreements and contracts. And this is quite this can be quite key, particularly when looking back at some of those operational capabilities, control types, and cybersecurity concepts as well. Because when we're thinking about, well, how can we apply 27,001 when we're building that third-party those third-party relationships and those third-party lifecycle model, this provides a core drive in thinking, well, how do we get from the risks that we've identified through to what do we need to consider from an agreement perspective, whether it's data breach notification and incident response and continuity, or more technical applications around access control, for example, based on how a third party may handle and access data or information or related systems as well. So it's very much staying in place from the previous version, but there's a lot more emphasis sort of placed on the application of supply chain, and this is extended to new controls around consideration for cloud services, given cloud is becoming so much more commonplace amongst many organizations and entities.
Thomas, just a quick one as we kind of progress into this slide, and that it touches on a question in the Q&A, which I think is quite relevant to what you were just talking about there. It's more prominent in cloud, and we've got more remote workers. We've got a lot more control in terms of, or control requirements in terms of access management. One of the questions that's been raised is how applicable is the physical controls in this era of remote working? How much control does an organization really have when a staff is working remotely?
Very good, very, very timely question. And yes, you're absolutely right. You only have to look at the last, 2 to 3 years in terms of this explosion of remote working, even to the level of companies still debating the relevance of a physical office space. So what's interesting about the new standard is they have, and even down to the level of terminology, they have expanded on some of the terms and use cases of end user devices and end user device management, for example. It's a greater consideration about using controls to protect organizational assets, but as well as BYOD based devices, as well as the concept of the remote working and work from home. It's always important to note that, particularly with ISO standards, they'll never get to a stage where they specifically mention technologies or applications, because it is universal, regardless of, let's say, sort of geography, country, and industry. But there is a wider acceptance in the framework around how you manage from a staffing perspective, how you manage from a mobile device perspective, particularly, as you say, given that there's so much more remote working and we've got our own sort of systems and assets as well. There still is physical security within the assessment that touches on some of the common areas. How do you protect sensitive assets? How do you protect if you have sensitive working areas? I guess what's then more pertinent here is how can you take some of those existing controls and put them in a home environment? So though maybe traditionally it'll be talking about server rooms in an office space, not so applicable obviously if you're working from home. So it's looking at how can we apply the same concepts from a work from home solution. So are there controls that organizations can ask employees to put in place around how they secure their assets? Are they working from areas where there may be exposure from a public perspective? Are they working in areas that have locked doors, locked areas, as well as the technological aspects of the laptops and phones and tablets that they're working through as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's move on to mapping those TPRM practices to an ISMS. Now, I think in quite a broad sense, we've got a few different areas to consider. So obviously thinking right from the top in terms of how do we identify our third parties? How do we identify from a profiling and tiering? How do we sort them into relevant buckets from high, medium, low, or criticality, or tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and understanding what are the risks when we're dealing with our third parties. And this is where different aspects of 27,000 come in quite nicely. So we can see clause 5.1, 6.1, and 6.2, and 6.3. And this is what ISO deems the high-level structure of its ISMS. And these are areas that focus around top management for an organization, planning and identifying resource and resource allocation, roles and responsibilities, as well as a very well-defined risk approach in terms of the identification and management of risk in terms of reviews, assessments, documentation, ownership, all the way through to the treatment of risk. And on top of that, clause 5.19, which is one of the security controls we briefly touched on earlier, information security and supplier relationship. Combined, these areas can help that process of saying, how do you identify what our third parties are doing? Do we have the necessary resource in the organization to help engage with third parties and to start identifying the level of service they're providing to us? But then down to applying that IS 27001 interpretation of risk management to start thinking about, if we already know what third parties are providing to us in terms of product and service, level of sensitive data or information systems, can we start to work out from clause 6.1, 6.12 and 6.13 the level of impact a loss of confidentiality, integrity and availability, so a loss of those areas of information could provide to us or could cause us, sorry. So there's a blend of high-level structure requirements as well as let's call them Annex A controls that can already help to start mapping those activities of identifying third parties and understanding what our risk is. Then we think about, well, how do you then address the security in those third-party agreements? Again, paying attention to the supply chain. And again, 519, 20, and 21, as we looked at in the previous slide, are all focused around those considerations in supplier agreements. And what 27002 does quite nicely is it already starts to offer suggestions in terms of areas you should consider. So do we need to think about data management, data breach notification? Do we need to think about incident and business continuity control? Do we need to think about areas around access and acceptable use of assets, for example, as well as physical security where appropriate? And so, again, through these three technical controls, we can already start to build a picture of what we might want to look at when we're building a third-party agreement or contract. Then we've got to the stage where we've put the third parties into, say, multiple tiers. We know the type of risks that we need to focus on, or that the business is concerned about, or the industry is concerned about. I'm thinking about the wider sort of industry take on third party and third party risk. And then you think about how we're now going to assess these third parties. And this is where these Annex A controls from organizational through to technical can come in, whether it's all encompassing or whether it's only a subset of controls based on those risks, based on what the third party agreements and what we're trying to aim for. So you can take the 27001, regardless of whether you're being certified or just using it as a best practice framework, to then build an assessment with which to assess or audit or review your suppliers against. And obviously the aim here is through that risk management approach, that should help in that identification of which controls are most critical to us. And again, that's an area we'll come on to in terms of how can we identify key controls, what perhaps some of the more impactful key controls that we should be considering generally, or more if we're looking more specifically about what third parties are providing to us. And then finally, we've got to the stage where we've identified our third parties. We've got formal agreements. We've assessed them. We're going through assessments on a 6-monthly, quarterly, annual basis. That final stage of how do you then look at that continual monitoring, continual review of those third parties, and then again, Section 522 or Control 522 goes through the specifics around, well, how can we and how should we be monitoring our third parties and our wider supply chain as well. So we can see a blend of both high-level structure controls in 27001, as well as the more Annex A technical controls around third-party and supply chain management or supply chain risk management as well. Just briefly touching on these three areas in a bit more depth, particularly around these new concepts. So when we're looking at the leadership aspect of the high-level structure, generally speaking, it asks organizations to define security policies, set objectives, and particularly ensuring resource is managed, is planned, and roles are clearly established, both in terms of managing activities, security activities, but also a reporting line back to top management, senior management, and any other critical interested party. So using that governance approach of, in this case, clause 5.1 of the standard, and again, looking at that 519 control, these two combined can start to help build that supply chain process and that case study in terms of how we're going to monitor and manage our suppliers. And thinking about, although it's focusing on security policy, the wider supply chain risk policy, and using clause 6.1 to build that risk management life cycle, can then help to establish how can we understand and identify what those third-party risks are, whether they're technical risks, whether they're risks based on, I'd say, industry and sector concerns, or other areas as well. And as mentioned, one of the strengths of 27001 is the fact that it does go into a lot of detail around thinking about setting that risk criteria and those processes for identifying, analysing, evaluating, and treating security risks. Particularly using very well-known approaches such as likelihood and impacts to give some level of risk scoring and risk rating, but as well as thinking the detail around, well, how do we treat those risks and based on those overall risk scores and the most critical risks, what do we want to mitigate versus avoiding, accepting, or going through another avenue of risk treatment and risk remediation as well. Addressing security and third-party agreements, as you've mentioned, 27,000 goes into quite a lot of depth in terms of considerations for what we need to think about in terms of third-party agreements. So once risks have been identified, those third parties and services are known, we can now start to think about what's giving us the most cause for concern. It could be based on what the third parties are doing, type of data that's being accessed. Are the levels of classification or sensitivity of that data that they're using? Are they holding our own, or are we procuring some sort of ICT information systems and information infrastructure that may be holding that type of sensitive data? And if so, is this a critical risk to us? Personnel requirements based on how many people and what people, and in particular if there are contractors as well as full-time employees, are there any requirements we need to consider and incorporating into contracts around screening and background checks of staff, levels of training and types of training that's being delivered? Is there more visibility around more common threats that we're seeing over the last 2 to 3 years around phishing and ransomware-based attacks, and how employees can respond to that, for example, as well as acceptable use of data assets and information assets as well. And so by identifying those bigger concerns, we can then start to piece together, based on those 4 control areas of organizational, people, physical, and technological, what's more important to us, and how can we distill from the 90 to 93, 94 controls that are captured in those 4 control areas. Do we want to cover everything, which in some cases may be relevant, particularly given the more complex organizations and more complex third parties, maybe based on the tiering and based on the nature of what they're providing? There may be a genuine need to look at an all-encompassing view of information security, capturing those 4 control areas. It may be based on the level of tiering that's been applied to the third party or the nature of what they're providing as a product or service, that there are areas that are less critical. Physical control, for example, based on if an organization doesn't have access to sensitive information and data, are we so concerned about some of the physical controls that organization may have, particularly if they still have a level of office space, or if they're renting office space, for example? How important are those physical controls in getting us to understand a good security posture for that organization? It may be that there are some controls that will always be mandatory, given the nature of what that third party is providing to us as well. So starting to join the pieces of what those risks are, the level of visibility of what the third parties are providing to us and the type of services they're providing, and then starting to piece together how many of those controls are we really concerned about, and do we want to assess our third parties against?
Thomas, just in terms of that kind of assessing the third party piece that you just talked about, and obviously we can dependent on, the criticality and the types of services, etc., would naturally determine the level of assessment or types of assessment. One question that's been asked, which is quite interesting here, what's the approach of the ISO restructuring towards business continuity and disaster recovery? What key controls are mapped to TPRM?
Yes, that's an interesting. So continuity still exists in the framework and around the organizational controls. I believe I've touched on I think one later in the rating assessments. We'll have a look at that one in more depth. But yes, when we look at particularly 27,002, there is more of a push to say, particularly in terms of recovery activities, there does need to be a link between obviously based on supplier activities and obviously services they're providing. But there needs to be consideration around what level of continuity, effort, and relationship you have with your supplier, particularly in terms of those agreements and sort of mandating some of those control areas. So there are topics around consideration for information security considerations in business continuity, developing continuity and disaster recovery programs, and testing those programs as well. And again, it's the testing element where, again, there is a bit more emphasis on when you're testing, you don't just test in isolation, but you're testing with your suppliers if necessary, where appropriate and where necessary. So bringing in critical suppliers to make sure that if your systems fail over or if there's an issue, there's a level of interlink between what suppliers need to be doing for yourself as well. So it comes in two areas, one from your own organizational aspect of managing continuity, but also asking suppliers specifically, what are your recovery efforts as well?
Yeah.
And how can you demonstrate that to us as well? So through testing programs, through key communication points, for example, key roles and responsibilities. I mean, one of the interesting areas that, again, is becoming more common is I thought I may have mentioned earlier, when it comes to the contracts, breach and breach notification is now the 27002 lists quite prominently, and that's a good example. So that if we have that unfortunate scenario where a vendor does suffer a data breach, have we captured from the agreement and through the way we assess our vendor how they're responding to us about the nature of the breach and what they've done to recover and get back to BAU. Because obviously if that's not captured in there, and if I'm missing that link, then as we know, that risk can increase greatly, particularly when it starts to involve regulators and law enforcement as well.
Yeah, of course.
Finally, monitoring, review, and reevaluate. So sending out the third-party assessment, of course, is only the beginning. What should we be doing, obviously, when the results come back? And this is where it's worth touching on these three aspects of operational capabilities, control types, and cybersecurity concepts. For anyone who's familiar with NIST, particularly, the cybersecurity concepts, or the concepts will be very familiar because these follow on based on NIST and NIST CSF, cybersecurity framework. So these 5 areas around identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover based controls, basic controls that can help organize your cybersecurity activities. We're thinking out OC, operational capabilities. These are attributes, and this is where we find a greater volume of attributes is around operational capability. And one of the key purposes here is to help assessors, practitioners of the framework when planning and delivering a management system. And then control types, so how controls can help modify risks, particularly where information security incidents occur. And these are split across preventative, detective, and corrective-based controls. So that is to say, controls that should be in place to help prevent the occurrence of a security incident, controls that are used to help detect vulnerabilities and weaknesses and when a security incident may occur. And then there's corrective controls, what is being put in place and what controls do we need to put in place post-incident to get back to usual. So again, thinking about some of the controls from a continuity perspective. And so you can see on the screen 3 examples. So from an operational capability perspective, let's look at information protection. And so looking at the 93-94 controls set out across the standard, there are several that are labeled with this concept of information protection. And we can see a few examples here, from protection against malware, classifying information, labeling information, protecting records, privacy and protection of personal information, and endpoint devices. And so because this is meant to be an aid to help assessors and practitioners, where it can be most useful is certainly at that end of the process where we're receiving risks back from our third parties, and let's say we're receiving 30, 40, 50, 60 risks back. And we're now at the stage of saying, well, what do we do with these? What do we manage? How do we manage these? We may have our risk scores of critical, high, medium, and low, or another similar process. But if we're already identifying capabilities that are relevant to us, for example, data security, information protection, we can then also group risks as well to say, well, how many risks are associated with information protection and protection-based controls? Can we start to see some trending here based on the type of controls that third parties that we're receiving from third parties based on their 27,001 assessment or the way they've carried out the assessment? In a similar vein, by categorizing controls based on, say, preventive, detective, or corrective controls. And as you can see here, corrective controls, incident management planning, incident response, readiness for continuity, disciplinary process where there's been a breach of corporate policy and security policy, and information backup. And again, if we can start to see there's a larger volume of risks around these particular controls, that may help to shape our view of how do we approach these, not necessarily in isolation, but together, particularly if you're seeing there's a trend between multiple organizations or third parties and risks in similar areas. And then in terms of cybersecurity concepts, so controls used in identifying good practice, identifying security requirements, so the supplier-based aspects, threat intelligence, and engaging with threat intelligence-based organizations, and how we inventory our information and other assets. So it can be used at the tail end in terms of how do we manage and bucket our risks, if you will. But it's also worth thinking about when we're looking at identifying key controls as well. If we know that there are capabilities that we're quite concerned about that are important to us based on our risks, whether it may be sort of threat and vulnerability management or data security or the protection of information or other areas, this can then help make it easier to say which controls are important to us. And thinking about those 94, which ones do we already know are applicable to these type of third parties? And this can then make it so much easier when we're starting to plan, do we need to give all 94 controls to this third party, this tier 1 or tier 2 organization, or can we give a subset based on capabilities that are important to us as a business and based on some of the security concepts that maybe over time we're seeing are more of a concern? If we feel, for example, that there are third parties, we're concerned more about the recovery and recovery efforts, let's look at those controls under the banner of recovery and recover in terms of cyber concepts, and perhaps we can use them as focused assessments and focused audits when engaging with our third parties. So it gives a lot more capability and really opens up the framework to give a lot more thought around which are the controls that are right for us at this time, and then when risks occur and when risks are apparent to us through the assessment and assessment results, how can we categorize these? And I say, are there any trends that are coming up that perhaps we have not been aware of, that are new to us, that we can pay attention to, particularly when engaging with the third parties, or at least explaining from an executive and top management perspective as well. So, impactful key controls. So, as indicated with 94 controls, there are many controls that will suit multiple risk scenarios and considerations for risk treatment. And so thinking about those cybersecurity concepts, if we can start to align the risks to controls that will help protect those assets, detect threats and vulnerabilities, or provide a level of response and recovery, all this can help determine what for us is key, particularly when we're looking at how we monitor and analyze the effectiveness of control requirements. Now, generally speaking, as stated from the beginning, this is a standard that's open to any organization in the world, regardless of industry and sector. So it can be quite difficult to work out, are there always controls that any organization, regardless of size and complexity, will need to adhere to or are recommended? In general, yes, there are always going to be some controls that we find almost all organizations, or 99% of organizations, should have in their back pocket. So whether it's areas concerning good access management and access controls, anything to do with managing a critical information system or critical data, naturally you want to be concerned about, are there good practices in how they manage privileged access rights and access reviews and assigning and revoking access? Data backup and data recovery, again, anything to do with proprietary information, intellectual property, personal information, having clear processes to back up and recover should the unfortunate happen. Again, these are also controls that we'd find most companies will be dealing with. And of course, we've briefly touched on it today around continuity as well, regardless of whether you are a one-person band, a mum and pop shop, or whether you're a 10,000 employee multinational organization. There will always be a need to having a level of continuity, obviously recovery and incident response as well. Obviously, it will look very different depending on the type of organization, but gives you an idea that there will always be some controls in standards like 27001 that we can apply across the board. Having said that, it's still important to recognize the fact that a lot of this comes down to how we develop and understand our risk and the risk of our third parties and our vendors. And understanding, particularly through those operational capabilities, for example, what are the areas that are most important to us. And obviously, the tighter we can get that and the more depth that we can bring to risk management activities and really working out what's concerning for us, what keeps us awake at night, can really help to start to tighten what controls do we need to focus on, whether it's in the short term, over the next 12 months, or in the long term, because we know these are long-term risks and risks that may never go away, rather than some that perhaps are more reactionary as well. Okay, so in terms of what are the most impactful key controls to think about in terms of are our third parties delivering best practice? This is a double-edged sword. There are some, but it very much depends on what the third parties are doing for you. But as I say, general areas around access management, access control, data backup, data security, continuity and incident response and recovery, and of course supply chain as well. So those 4 controls we covered from 519 to 522 around managing supply chain and supply chain security. I would always recommend that those are good controls to always start with, particularly with, as stated, with the supply chain control part. It helps set the scene in really getting to grips with what are we asking third parties to do for us. What do we need them to satisfy and to demonstrate to us it satisfies they've got good practice in place based on the product and service they're supplying. Sorry. Go ahead.
I think are relevant in terms of, and I know you're looking at those kind of key controls and I guess how that applies in terms of what deems critical depending on the service. But and I think a lot of our listeners in on the calls today will probably resonate with this in terms of some of those larger organizations, the Googles, the Microsofts, the AWSs of the world, typically could have kind of readiness evidence to support those key control mappings and monitoring. Is there an expectation that those major suppliers provide readiness evidence so that each of their customers do not have to test continuously? Or is that a case of the standard is not necessarily directed at some of those specific organizations and it's a standard for any organization to adopt?
So firstly, it is a standard for anyone to adopt. Interestingly, when you look at areas like, let's take Amazon and Microsoft, for example, particularly around their data centers and their cloud operations, they particularly Microsoft is a good example. They've been certified for multiple ISO certifications for years, and I believe Microsoft even is part of some of the committees in developing the frameworks as well. So there's a lot of recognition from those very large organizations of the importance of these standards. And you are quite right. When we see these companies often have, 4, 5, 6, they'll have ISO frameworks, they'll have SOC 2 assessments, they'll have PCI DSS, they may have other different frameworks based on the nature of what the organization is doing. And so it is very common for them to push out, this is our default pack of cybersecurity controls and data privacy controls as well. That's very common. One of the reasons for that, I think, is because they have so many audits globally anyway, through regulators, through customers, through other agencies, that to respond to every individual business would be, they'll just say, no, we can't do that. So that is common practice. There are certain things you can always do to make sure that, are they applying some good best practices anyway? Certainly having visibility of the most up-to-date certifications is one level of comfort. The difficulty, I think, with certification sometimes and standards, you can receive a copy of an ISO certificate, for example, and other certificates, and that'll tell you locations of where and the scope of what's being applied. And so you can have a level of comfort knowing that if they've been certified by an independent organization, there'll always be some controls I mentioned earlier around sort of access, data security, continuity, for example, that should be in place, because these are controls 9 times out of 10 will never be excluded from any business. And so that if a major incident were to occur in a Amazon data center, for example, as part of its cloud setup, you would fully expect them to have a very well executed continuity and recovery activity or transfer between systems. So yes, large organizations, it can be a challenge sometimes, particularly obtaining information, particularly if you're trying to do an assessment on them. But it is common that, yes, many of them will have default statements around security concepts and privacy concepts as well, both publicly available as well as on request. But yes, again, it sort of represents that how universal particularly ISO standards are in complexity of organization using them.
Yeah, absolutely. One quick question in terms of, does ISO 27K facilitate in any way a risk management integration with other risk families? So, financial, reputational, etc.
So outside of 27, there are other frameworks. The most perhaps recognized is a standard called ISO 31000, which is a risk management standard, not too dissimilar to NIST risk management framework as well. It's universal in the sense that it doesn't focus on privacy or security and or other particular business and strategic risks as well. And so they do have standards that can be used across the board, particularly if you're trying to integrate as well, which is important. And when you look at some of the language used, say in 27001 versus ISO 31000, there's a lot of similarity there. And in fact, 27 makes reference to 31K in that regard. So they do have some universal risk management frameworks that you can apply from a, say, business strategic perspective, or financial, or environmental, or other avenue of risk as well.
Perfect, thank you.
So with the volume of controls available throughout the 27000 standard, which ones are more critical? So as I say, it can be difficult to put a finger on them. We've got a few examples here. So if you're thinking about sensitivity, or sensitive or critical data is being accessed and handled, this is where we can think about, well, what protection and protect-based controls can we leverage from the framework? So controls around access and authentication, data protection that touches on encryption and DLP, methods for remote working and securing remote working environments and endpoint devices, and protection against malware. So 27001 has a few technical controls that touch on all of these concepts, where if we know that we're concerned about sensitive and critical data third parties accessing, we can already start to build a program based on how protect-based controls are grouped together in the framework, and that can help make it easier in determining well, we need visibility and validation that these type of controls are in place. Similarly, if you're looking at security of critical information systems and the nature of what's on these systems, we want some protection-based controls. You also want a level of recovery-based controls as well. So how is this equipment being sited and protected? Again, even more pertinent now, as we discussed earlier, in terms of this concept of more work from home, remote working, working lifestyle. How are those systems that may be accessing highly sensitive information, how are they protected from physical space? Capacity management of those systems and how capacity management forecasting and planning and thresholds are being established. Backup of information and redundancy in if those critical information systems fall over, what level of redundancy is in place? Are we looking at perhaps more traditional areas where there might be still server rooms and data centers and backup data centers, or is there something else in terms of level of redundancy? Naturally, there'll always be crossover between different controls, and there'll be controls when we're thinking about critical information system that we could take from concerns around sensitive or critical data and data management as well. But it starts to give you an indication of where we could start to draw on these concepts, these topics, to identify protect-based controls, information protection-based controls that can start to form what we want to drive as key controls, mandatory controls that we expect third parties to implement. So then we move on to, well, we've got a program, we've got an established criteria of assessments. We're launching assessments to our third parties. So what else do we need to think about? Also, when thinking about KRIs, key risk indicators, we need to think about our wider risk landscape. So in this case, it may be concerning third-party management and the level of risk that carries. It's important to make sure we're developing indicators based on obviously those type of risks and risk areas the organization has decided is important and imperative to monitor, whether that's areas around, say, malware detection, data breach and breach response, supply chain threats, ransomware, phishing, and other critical areas as well. So those critical areas around concerning, say, data loss, wider supply chain susceptibility to ransomware, other targeted targets. Of course, developing an assessment using a standard like 27001 can help frame those best practice controls to get that level of assurance that third parties are maintaining that good security posture. That, for example, handling of sensitive critical data and information system requires. So when thinking about what risks are critical to us and what we deem are the highest or most concerning risks, thinking about how we apply different ISO controls to help gain that validity and validation and visibility from third parties that they're applying best practice is obviously one step to being able to have that statement and to start to make those decision points. So thinking about event logging, protection against malware, security awareness and awareness training, security during disruptions and information incidents, levels of cryptography applied, supply chain information security control points. And there's many other controls that can help treat and respond to those risks and address those potential risks. Obviously, managing vendor risks over 6, 12, 18 months or longer timeframes, key risks that we've identified obviously may change, whether it's both new risks and new and emerging risks, or where there's trends amongst vendors, particularly in terms of failing to adopt a good security practice or good security hygiene. So viewing those ongoing improvements of how risks are reducing, or in some cases not going away with third parties on a year-on-year basis, can help to provide that assurance or visibility, particularly to senior management, to make sure those risks are being managed in a timely manner. So starting to look at, well, how do we apply indicators based on what are our biggest risks and our biggest risk areas, and how those risks are either increasing over time or through the application of assessments, of assurance, of audit and security controls. Are we demonstrating that those risk areas are starting to reduce, or we've got more confidence that should a risk occur, there's sufficient control to protect, to detect, to respond and recover, for example. Secondly, obviously, when thinking about key performance indicators and use of that 27001 standard to drive down vendor risk, we're starting to identify those key controls that will best address those third-party risks. And so maybe looking at a higher level overall vendor security ratings. So we've identified and put them in various tiers and buckets, the vendors, and we know that where our most critical risks are. So which ones can we get to a stage where we can identify our highest risk vendors, monitoring those overall vendor risk ratings over time, and the level of time it's taking to respond and resolve risks, so that if we can see those security ratings starting to come down, security is starting to mature in the organization, that can be a good indication, again, back up to senior management and executives, that those higher risk vendors are being managed correctly, being managed efficiently, and where risk is being presented, it's being resolved in a suitable fashion. But also thinking about other areas. So once we've identified those high risk vendors, what is their level of security preparedness? So can we look at or engage in visibility of, well, what's the percentages of completed awareness and training? What levels of threat detection and response to vulnerabilities is being captured by the third parties based on what product or service they're supplying to us? Quality of testing for continuity and incident response. We're asking through the contracts and agreements how the third parties tell us whether it's a data breach and data breach notification. Do we have visibility that they have continuity plans that are managed and reviewed every 6 months, every 12 months, that they're tested regularly, so that should the worst case scenario happen, a ransomware or similar targeted attack, for example, do they have processes already in place and have prepared and have identified what the most appropriate controls are to help secure those services and secure those products and systems and operations. So thinking about that and thinking about some of the key targets, we might need to consider how we identify and apply key controls, all the way tied back to information security risk management. So what can we do now? So on the one side is also we need to start thinking about how we can use 27001, particularly the governance, the high-level structure, and those risk framework to enhance or develop that third-party process. So using that structured process so we can work out what are the most critical risks that we need to be concerned about when engaging with our third parties, identifying those risk and control requirements, and obviously using those operational capabilities, those cybersecurity concepts to help frame the assessment content that we need to engage our third parties on, and they'll help determine the level and the complexity of those assessments. Again, using that ISO 27001 control annex as the driver. And obviously, once completing that section, then publishing those security assessments, and then going through that continual process of monitoring, reviewing. Are the targets we're identifying, are they improving? Are we getting to a stage where security preparedness across our third parties or vendors is improving? Are those risk ratings being driven down? So those perhaps traditionally very high risk or high concern vendors, actually they're maturing their security posture, and it's giving us a great more deal of comfort in terms of good best practice from a security step perspective. Okay. Before we end, I'll briefly hand it over to Scott.
Hey, thanks so much, Thomas. I appreciate that. If you could stop sharing your screen so I could share mine, that would be good. I just have one slide to share with everyone before we open it up to Q&A. I don't want to keep anybody too long today. All right, so terrific. All right, so real quick, I'm not going to, go into the overview of Prevalent today because we just don't have the time for that after that really rich webinar. But I do want to remind everybody that we have resources available at your disposal to help you maximize the use of the ISO framework in your organizations as it applies to third-party risk. We've developed a very comprehensive guide that maps common ISO controls to certain KPIs and KRIs and metrics in the organization that you're going to want to apply, and then help to demystify some of the complexities in ISO and clarify some of this risk mappings as well. So if you're looking for a quick guide, and yes, 30 pages is a quick guide, if you're looking for a quick guide to apply ISO to your TPRM program, we've developed a checklist for you to enable that. So no cap, that's all I wanted to share with you guys today. I'm going to pass it back to Ashley, and she'll open up for questions.
Yes, thanks, Scott. And please go check out the ISO checklist. We have a ton of phenomenal resources on our website. We just have one in the chat, and it's actually for you, Scott. It says, how does the Prevalent platform support the rollout of these TPRM practices and or NIST, in linkage to ISO or NIST frameworks?
Yeah, great question. So we have a series of questionnaires that Thomas and his team have built and have uploaded into the Prevalent platform. We've got more than 600 questionnaire templates in the platform, and several of those are dedicated to the individual sections within ISO. So we have specific risks based on answers and thresholds that are applied, and then evidence that's uploaded to address those particular controls and questions. And then with the risk mappings, you get, in effect, a risk score that tells you kind of the areas that you need to really focus on with that vendor or supplier as per those controls. So it's all kind of a framework in the system, and then the reporting helps to define what to do next with it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Thomas, Sophie, and Scott, and everyone for all of your questions. They all gave us some fantastic information to take in today. So hope to see all of you either in your inbox or at a future Prevalent webinar. Cheers, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.
Bye, everyone.
you.